recording and introduce our panel. I'd like to welcome everyone to this next session in our day-long track focused on 21st century child abuse, the impact of digital technologies. This panel is focused on responses to online child abuse and exploitation. And I'd like to introduce you to each of our panelists. The first person I'd like to introduce is Jacqueline Bouchier. Jacqueline is the first ever global head of platform safety at Snap Incorporated, formerly known as Snapchat. Snap recruited Jacqueline from Microsoft, where she was a global digital safety advocate for over 20 years, and she in fact served as the chief online safety officer at Microsoft for 6 years. She sat on numerous boards that represent child safety and cyber safety in the technology industry, and previously served as Microsoft's representative to the Family Online Safety Institute and the National Cyber Security Alliance, among others. We also have with us today Ian Drennan. Ian is an executive director at We Protect Global Alliance, where for almost 4 years he has been leading the world's largest and most diverse multi-sectoral alliance to tackle online child sexual abuse and exploitation. Prior to that, Ian was the head of the international team tackling exploitation and abuse in the UK's Home Office. And then finally, I'd like to introduce Sean Litton. Sean is the executive director of the Technology Coalition, which he has overhauled in the past nearly 3 years. He has significantly expanded the membership of the Tech Coalition to 33 companies and has been growing member commitments to research, transparency, tech innovation, knowledge sharing, and online child safety. Prior to leading the Tech Coalition, Sean served with the International Justice Mission for over 20 years, including nearly 5 as president of the IJM. So I'd like to ask first, Jacqueline, what are some of the challenges that you see children and families facing online today, and the work that you're trying to do at Snap to combat these challenges?
So first of all, thank you so much, Warren, for having us here today. It's a privilege to be with you and have this conversation. To your first question about the challenges that children and families face online, I would say that teens, and indeed all age groups, they can face issues from contact. So the contact that they have with others, both those whom they know and those whom they don't know, and they can encounter issues from the content that they both share and consume. When we look at parents or caregivers or others, they generally tell us that they're overwhelmed in the digital space, and they have a hard time keeping up with all of the devices and the platforms and the apps and the services that their young people might be engaging with. So they're worried about issues like online bullying, exposure to drugs and to sexual risks, overuse and oversharing, and the potential impacts on their teens' mental and emotional well-being.
And so in your role, first at Microsoft and now at Snap, have you been able to do research to understand, where these risks are coming from and some of the harms that both parents and youth are fearful may be affecting them in these digital spaces?
Indeed. I started some research at Microsoft several years ago, and I've continued a variation of it since I've been at Snap. And we call this at Snap our Digital Wellbeing Index. And what we do is we talk to teens ages 13 to 17, young adults ages 18 to 24, and also parents of teenagers between the ages of 13 and 19. And we ask them about their exposure to a large number of risks, anything from cyberbullying and harassment to just unwanted contact generally, or sexual risks, sexual exploitation, drugs, weapons, privacy invasions, and so forth. And what they're telling us, we did this research for the first time last year in 2022. And we asked all of those groups in 6 different countries, including the US and the UK, France, Germany, India, and Australia, about their exposure. And the operative time for this research, Warren, was between basically February and May of 2022. And in that period of time, 3/4 of the population that we surveyed told us that they had encountered one of those risks over just the course of the last 3 months. So the risk is out there, they're experiencing the risks, and the question is, what can we do to help them address them and help them stay resilient against the risk?
So one of the things that I noticed, Jacqueline, is when you talk about these challenges, you're also talking about trying to empower children and youth to manage their risks. Do you see this as being solely, the youth and children's responsibility to protect themselves, or are there other components to keeping children and youth safe online that we need to make sure to empower and put in place?
Absolutely. This is a joint responsibility, a shared responsibility amongst all stakeholder groups. So I say it starts with tech companies. We have built this instrumentality, and it's our responsibility to make sure that we are protecting our users from any harm. We are preventing any harm from coming to them. We are responding to their needs and their concerns. And also we want to make sure that we are learning and adapting, because we know that the bad actors out there and the adversaries are doing just that. But by the same token, governments, law enforcement, parents, educators, civil society members, NGOs in the safety space, and the teens and the young people themselves. Everyone has a role to play. It's just a matter of knowing when one role ends and when another role begins. But we want to make sure that we're empowering them with tools and resources and materials and functionality to help protect themselves, and giving them good advice and guidance as well.
So you've talked about, youth, then you've talked about the responsibility of the tech companies, and you've talked about responsibility of governments. Can we talk for a minute about parents? Because earlier you were talking about the fact that parents are feeling overwhelmed. I'm the mom of a 13-year-old and a 20-year-old. I'm pretty tech savvy. I've tried to put every reasonable control, in my kids' tech space as possible so that they are protected. But like you say, it is overwhelming, and sometimes the resources don't feel like they're there. What are you doing at Snap and in the tech industry to try and empower parents as well, so that we can step into the space of working with our children and the tech companies and the governments to keep kids safe in the space? So
I've got some specific advice and guidance for parents, and then I can tell you what we're doing in terms of the features and the functionality and the technological resources that we're putting into play. So if I could first focus on those parents and caregivers and other trusted adults, I would say the first and most important thing is to have regular, open, and honest conversations with teens, and to listen, and to try to suspend judgment. And I know that that can be difficult because they've grown up in a very different world to us, but to be able to plot a course of action together. And I would say for Snapchat, Snap is the parent company of Snapchat. That is the app. It's 13 plus. So we don't have children on Snapchat. It's teens 13 and up. But these conversations should begin well in advance of when a young person is eligible to be on social media, again, 13 and above. Nothing magical happens on their 13th birthday. They're not suddenly different when they turn 13 versus when they were 12 and 364 days old, right? So adults need to make sure that teens register with their correct birth year when they go onto a social media platform. There are features and other protections that are available to younger users, but they have to be honest at that time of registration and make sure that these platforms are not designed for children. They are designed for 13 and up. So we have to make sure that we're being honest and open about that. And I would say that even if adults aren't comfortable with technology, I like to say that they need to appreciate the difference between what I call intelligence and wisdom. So be open to the young people teaching you about the technology. Ask them to give you a tour of their online world, and be confident that you've been around the block, you've lived, and you can help identify risk and risky behaviors and help them navigate these spaces appropriately. And then get help from those technological tools that are out there. On Snapchat, we have something that is new, just about a year old now. It's called Family Center, and it really tries to give adults and parents and caregivers insight into who their teens are connecting with on the app, while preserving the privacy of the teen and not letting the adults see the actual communications that are being shared.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Sean, I want to talk to you a little bit about what's going on industry-wide. I mean, when Snapchat first came on the market, it was known among my students as being the app that people would use to share nudes or provocative photos. And it was a platform that I wouldn't allow my own kids to use for that reason. And then when I found out that Snap had recruited Jacqueline away from Microsoft, I was like, okay, what are we going to see here? And I've been watching carefully the changes that have been made under Jacqueline's leadership, and really watch Snap starting to rebrand itself as more of a family-friendly, age-appropriate platform. And I'm wondering if Snap is exceptional in moving in this direction, or if this is a trend that you're seeing across the tech industry as parents and the public raise more and more concerns about some of their kids' experiences online.
Yeah, thank you, Warren, and thank you for having me with you today. Well, first of all, Jacqueline's doing an exceptional job at Snap, and her leadership's making a huge difference there. And I'm really, they're a member of the Tech Coalition, and I'm proud of the progress that they're making. I would say the general trend in industry is greater investment and greater resourcing on these issues, and a greater awareness of the potential harms, and an increase in efforts to address them. And I mean, the first question you asked is, what are the specific types of harms or threats that we're most focused on? And within the Tech Coalition is a coalition of about, it was 33, I guess, when they sent my biography to you. Now it's 36 leading tech firms that have come together to kind of pool their collective knowledge and resources to try and lift all the boats and address these issues. And the two primary issues we're trying to address are, one is the distribution and publication of child sexual abuse material, which previously was called child pornography. And then secondly, the internet is made for sharing information, right? And so a lot of efforts have been made on that. And then secondly, trying to prevent people from using their platforms or the internet to access children for the purposes of exploitation. So those are the two primary threat vectors we're seeking to address. And we address those, we can talk more about that later, through an array of different, everything from policy interventions and practice to technology, et cetera. But, generally from where I sit, I've been working with the industry for the last 3 years, and there's an extraordinary amount of momentum in the right direction right now. Part of that's in response to public demand and public pressure. And part of that's, a growing awareness of how the problems manifest and what the consequences are of those problems. The advocacy of different survivor groups, I think, has made a huge difference as well. And industry is increasingly aware of the potential for harm and threat. And so, as a desire to be good corporate actors, and, actually it's just good business to have a safe product. There's been increasing investment there, and we're focused primarily on facilitating the collaboration between the companies.
Thank you so much, Sean. So when you're talking about like policy interventions, for example, are there specific policies that the tech industry is more receptive to than others? I mean, historically, this has been an industry that we have exempted from most regulation because we wanted to nurture it, that this was groundbreaking in the late 20th century. And so we exempted them from liability to an extent that no other major industry in the United States has really been exempted from. And that was to incentivize creating these platforms where people can come together and create content in a collaborative way. And yet, as you've said, because there are so many different points of access to these platforms, we sometimes have, bad people doing bad things and to vulnerable members of the population, including children. And you mentioned, for example, CSAM, the child sex abuse material, and the amount of trafficking of CSAM that we're seeing on the internet. And yet, as you know, the industry has been exempted from, hosting that content since they did not post it, edit it, etc. So you just mentioned that was one of the areas that the industry is interested in focusing on. So how can the industry focus on this? Is it technological innovations that the industry is exploring to identify CSAM and to remove it? Is it, particularly regulations that they're more receptive to? Can you tell us a little bit about specifically what the tech industry kind of holistically is more likely to be receptive to?
Yeah, and I apologize for the confusion. When I was talking about policy, I was talking about internal company policy with respect to, for example, their user agreement and their terms of service. So making it very clear what is allowed and what is not allowed, and making it very clear that, child sexual abuse material is not permitted. So in terms of like the company's response to CSAM, it starts with a technology that started, and Jacqueline's very familiar with this. It came out of Microsoft called PhotoDNA, which is whereby if they have an image of known CSAM, they can give it a digital identifier called a hash. And then the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which Ernie used to lead, has a database of these hashes of all known CSAM. And companies access that database and run those hashes against images that are their users attempt to upload. And if it comes back as CSAM, then they block the upload of that image, or they take it down when they find it. So that's hash-based detection. And I would say it's very common among what I would say responsible platforms to have hash-based detection for still images, and also for video. It's a little bit different technology for video, but that only protects against known CSAM. And then the question is, what about previously undetected or novel, newly created CSAM? And for that, you need something like machine learning, some kind of classifier using technology to estimate whether an image is potentially CSAM, and then it usually gets kicked over for human review, which is extremely burdensome, but necessary to ensure that the accuracy of the determination. And then if it is determined to be CSAM, it's blocked and it's reported to NCMEC. And you were talking about, exempt from legal obligations, and I understand there's a lot of truth in that, but one area, at least in the US, where they've been clear is that if a company has actual awareness of CSAM, they have an obligation to quarantine that material and report it to NCMEC. And then NCMEC, and Ernie can talk more about this, acts as the referral mechanism out to law enforcement for follow-up. So that's an obligation for all companies based in the United States.
So
they know about it when it's known.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sean. So, we have these literally hundreds of millions of reports of CSAM going to NCMEC. And as you say, we have this robustly growing body of abuse imagery that's being collected. And it's being assigned its hash, but at the same time that is happening, we're seeing more end-to-end encryption on many of the platforms where the material is being trafficked. And so, for example, Meta, the parent of Facebook, has been one of the biggest reporters of CSAM historically, and yet with their movement to end-to-end encryption to stay competitive with, for example, Apple products, that we're now losing them as a source of reporting as to who is trafficking in the CSAM. So do you see a collision between that end-to-end encryption that's being advanced for privacy reasons and our ability to identify who is trafficking in child abuse imagery?
Yeah, I mean, there is a tension there, obviously, between privacy and attempts at detection, and I know Ernie and Ian will have thoughts on this as well. Um, right now, the general progression is towards encryption for purposes of privacy. That's where the market is moving. And what we have to do is figure out in that context, how do we do detection based on meta information, related to the conversations, where they originated, patterns of communication, without actually looking inside the communication itself. So that is there's a lot of work going on that right now. I don't think there's not an industry standard answer to that question right now. I think different companies are taking different approaches, but I do know that they are working on it as they move in that direction.
One of the things that you mentioned was the law enforcement and different responsibilities of internet service providers to cooperate with law enforcement. I received a grant that was funded by the State Department a few years ago and interviewed a number of law enforcement in the Pacific Northwest, and then a separate research project up in Canada where I was able to interview them and talk about their experience and their ability to really go after some of these digital crimes that are being focused on children. And on a consistent basis, they expressed a few concerns that were affecting their ability to effectively investigate these crimes. And one of them was a lack of tech savviness, that the technology is changing so quickly, and they're not really well prepared to keep up with all of the innovations that are being developed by the tech company. And another thing that they said is that whereas some of the technology companies were very cooperative when the police would issue a subpoena, others would not cooperate, even when it was fairly clear that the subpoena was, perfectly drafted. And I'm wondering if you could speak to those two issues, the challenges that you're hearing law enforcement face, and if there's more that technology companies and the industry overall could do in order to empower law enforcement to effectively go after the bad actors, without becoming an arm of the government directly, which of course raises its own legal issues.
Right. So great question, and an important issue. One of the things we do at the coalition is we also facilitate engagement with external stakeholders. And obviously one of the key stakeholders in this conversation is law enforcement. And so every year we're at the Crimes Against Children conference in Dallas with the law enforcement. And for example, this year we hosted a conversation between both US federal and then international law enforcement on exactly this issue on reporting. And there's a number of different issues there. So the law in the US on reporting is the government's not in a position to require a lot of detail in those reports. So if there is detail in those reports, it's on the company to do it basically voluntarily. And so we talked a little bit about what type of information is most helpful and why it's helpful, and helping the companies to understand how it impacts the timeliness of the intervention, right? Because in some of these cases, every minute really matters. And so when there's a slow response to a subpoena, that can mean, something bad continues to happen until that subpoena is answered. So, so what we're trying to do is help the companies to understand, what law enforcement situation is, why they're asking for the information. And then the other thing is we're working with the companies to encourage them to do what we call supplemental reporting, which is to provide additional information so that law enforcement has a more complete picture. But you also have to understand there's an issue here where the companies cannot become de facto law enforcement officers, right? Because if they do that, if they become, quote, agents of the state, then everybody's Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure apply. So the companies, they need to kind of follow the law and cooperate with the law, but they can't become agents of the state, and they have to walk a pretty careful line on that. But I do agree that it's important that they respond to subpoenas on a timely basis.
Thank you so much, Sean. And here we're talking about kids, we're talking about parents, we're talking about government, we're talking about law enforcement, and we're talking about a private-public partnership in the form of NECMEC. And you're charged with leading We Protect Global Alliance, which brings it all together and is theoretically supposed to be taking this multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral approach to combat what many say is, the greatest or one of the greatest challenges facing society at this point in history. So, what are some of the things that are working in trying to develop this alliance that is fraught with a lot of tensions? And, and what are some of the challenges that you're really struggling with right now?
Oh, no, it's a great question, and I definitely would see my role and the role of my team really is to facilitate and enable our members to deliver the best possible response. So we have over 200 members from government, from civil society, from the private sector, and that's not just tech, that's the financial sector, that's looking at some of the really exciting safety tech companies that are out there, and then also law enforcement, international organizations, civil society. So fundamentally, this is a global problem. This is a transnational problem. This is a problem that crosses jurisdictions, that crosses even neat ways of classification. So we work with governments, and in some countries we work with the Ministry of Interior. In some we work with the Ministry of Technology or Digital work. In others, it's Ministry of Children. So even within that one sector, it can be in different places. So I think that's one challenge. It's a problem that doesn't fit neatly into structures that have been set up. I think the other thing is that child sexual abuse online sits at the center of a Venn diagram linked with all kinds of other harms. So, for example, child sexual abuse that's taking place in the physical environment, or other forms of violence against children, or other online harms, like terrorist use of the internet or disinformation. And then it also has links into the public health space, the education space. So then, I think another key challenge that we have is to avoid perpetuating silos and to work with our members to help deliver a response that doesn't sit in a niche and isn't, but has links with national action plans for health, for education, and indeed for digital connectivity. The ideal is that it's built into those plans and integrated with those plans. And that's even more acute if you're a government that doesn't have a huge amount of resource to spare. I think the final challenge I'd like to speak about is around trust. And that, I think, is where some of the tensions come in, because prior to We Protect Global Alliance being set up, and that was only in the early 2010s, I think there were a number of echo chambers. So the civil society groups would speak primarily with civil society. Tech would speak to tech. And that means we're only going to get part of the perspective. And also there are misconceptions as to what other sectors are doing. And that, I think, it stands in the way of us delivering an effective response, because as you touched on at the start, it needs to, no single entity can resolve this by itself. So it's not in the same way as it's not all on parents, so definitely not all on children, it's not all on tech companies either. Government has a strong role, civil society has a strong role, law enforcement. All of that comes together to deliver a holistic response. And I think in the absence of dialogue, what you can get is very stereotyped versions of what the others. So that government is out to stifle innovation, or that they're out to destroy privacy. And I think once we start engaging with the nuance of the problem, and it's a very complex problem. It's, I think, my perspective, one of the great wicked problems that we're dealing with as a global society. I think we exist to kind of deal with some of those difficult questions, deal with the complexities, and try and build up trust and dialogue between and amongst our members.
So thank you so much, Ian. One of the ways that we build trust in a society and in relationships, for better or for worse, and maybe this is a very American framing, but is accountability. And earlier, Sean and I talked about the immunity that was given the tech industry in order to foster its growth early on, and that it's continued to enjoy. And I worked on the U.S. Supreme Court case, Caroline versus U.S., about 10 years ago, which involved the possession of abuse imagery of several victims. But in particular, one of the victims was Amy, and an economist that did an analysis of the damage that was done to Amy as a result of the hands-off abuse, the trafficking in her abuse imagery was estimated as distinct from the hands-on abuse, that was then recorded previously, but the amount of damages was estimated to exceed $3 million across the course of her lifetime. And as both you and Sean brought up, a lot of these crimes are cross-border crimes. And I know that in your previous role and continuing in your current role, that you have to think a lot about the cross-border aspect of internet crimes. And when I testified with the UK's Independent Inquiry into Child Sex Abuse, and one of the things that was very clear in preparing for that testimony was that the UK and other countries aren't doing nearly enough when the victim is in a different country. And when we talk about what governments can do to better protect children and victims of crimes that are committed using digital tools, what efforts are you aware of that can be held out as exemplary in order to ensure cross-border enforcement of some of these crimes, instead of just focusing on, the members of your own society and holding them accountable for when they do bad things about kids? Can you speak to that cross-border aspect a little bit more, Ian, and progress that's being made in our ever-shrinking world?
Yeah. No, it's absolutely critical. This is a crime where you can have a victim in one country, you can have a perpetrator in another country, and they're using a platform or a service that is headquartered in another jurisdiction entirely. And it's very, very complex for law enforcement officers to navigate that. The processes can be slow, they can be clunky. But there are lots of ways, I think, that are happening right now to try and improve that. I think the work Sean touched on about giving guidance and support to tech companies as to what they need to include in reports to make those as effective and efficient as they possibly can be to promote action. But I was also privileged to go to two international law enforcement meetings involving practitioners over the past year. So one is the Virtual Global Task Force, which is a group that specializing bringing together law enforcement bodies to drive collaboration. So it's a group drawing members from all around the world, and that they are experts coming together to focus on specifically online child sexual abuse, and they do a great job as well of inviting in other participants from outside of law enforcement to get those perspectives. The other one is the specialists group on crimes against children that Interpol hosts. And that's been in operation for many years now. It's a very mature body with subcommittees, excellent research that's feeding into that. And again, it's designed to, taking advantage of the global reach that Interpol has, to use that structure. And the Crimes Against Children team there is doing incredible work. They also have a database on child sexual exploitation, called ICSI from the acronym, and they're continually working to add to that database and get more police forces around the world signed up to that. And they also offer training for them on how to use it. I think there will always be a place for voluntary collaboration, and because we are never going to, we're human beings, we're never going to get to a point where legislation is all aligned. We can get it to a point, it's something to aim for, but I think there will always be a place for voluntary collaboration and engagement. So I think that sits alongside effective regulation to deliver a holistic response. I'd say finally on cross-border collaboration, there's a really interesting initiative that UNICRI and the UAE government have been taking forward around promoting use of AI tools with law enforcement bodies, so providing training on how to use them, providing access and an easy way to get hold of these tools. And they do have immense potential. There's a lot of talk at the moment about the downsides of generative AI, and potentially we can talk about that later. But I'd say that the flip side of that is that AI tools do have immense potential for reducing, for prioritizing the workload for law enforcement officers and making those cross-border operations more effective and more likely to succeed.
And I'm going to push back on you a little bit, Ian, because, as you know, the second optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that's protocol, of course, that focuses on child prostitution and child pornography, which we generally refer to as CSAM. But in any event, that actually obligates countries that are parties to that protocol to work together in order to have cross-border enforcement. And I think it's, especially applicable now that we have so much connection via the internet. And so, while voluntary collaboration is important, for the United States and many other countries who are parties to that protocol, it's actually a legal obligation that we have affirmatively and voluntarily assumed as a nation that obligates us to work together on these cross-border initiatives of protecting children and enforcing their rights and their claims against their abusers.
So I'd probably nuance my answer slightly to say that where I'm thinking of voluntary collaboration, it's how to make that easy. So I think, yes, the officer, because they're dedicated law enforcement officers, they will go and they will try and they will make it work. But I think this is about making those processes more effective, more efficient, faster. I think speed is absolutely of the essence when you're talking about a child that's in peril. So I think there's much more we can do, absolutely. But I think there's there's a lot of recognition. Maybe Ernie can speak to this. I think the general trend is a positive one in terms of deepening collaboration and awareness in other countries as well of this of what this problem is, and that it's not just something that happens in the United States or Europe. It's something that's happening right there in countries in Asia, Latin America, Africa.
Thank you so much, Ian. I want to come back to you, Jacqueline, because you and I, we previously have talked about children's rights and the fact that the internet and these digital platforms, that they also have positive health effects for children, and they also allow children to exercise some of their rights, that children have rights of participation, they have rights of assembly, they have rights of freedom of expression, and rights of education, and that the internet and these digital platforms can allow children to exercise their rights. And I'm wondering if in some of the research that you've done, both at Microsoft and at SNAP, if you've seen health benefits to children and youth and having access to some of these platforms, and what are they? As a concerned parent or social worker or other frontline provider, service provider, what are some of the things that we should be supporting children in doing and using these platforms in healthy ways?
Sure. Happy to jump in there. I would say that our latest research that I just shared with you, this digital well-being index from last year, we asked all of the youth, the Gen Z youth across all of those 6 countries, just what do you get out of social media? And actually 78% of them said to us that it is a positive force in their lives. And the very digital well-being index itself showed us, we've positioned this, that we've given them 20 sort of sentiment statements to respond to. And we calculated a digital well-being index for each of the participants, and then across each of the 6 countries, and then each of the 6 countries boiled up into one kind of global conglomerate, if you will. And we're asking them about their positive and negative emotions that they're having online. We're asking them about their engagement, their relationships, their sense of achievement and accomplishment. And for the most part, youth are doing okay. And one of the things that the research also showed, Warren, was those young people that have more support assets available to them in their schools, in their homes, in their communities. And that could be a parent, another relative, a peer, a sibling, a classmate, someone in the community, like a coach or a counselor or a member of the clergy that kind of has their back. There is a stronger correlation with positive and flourishing and thriving digital well-being among those young people who have more support assets available to them. So we kind of put together a little bit of a continuum. Those who are struggling when it comes to digital well-being, those are who kind of in the middling category, those who are thriving, and those who are flourishing. And those who had more digital support assets available to them had a greater impact on their digital lives. So more were thriving, more were flourishing. And those with fewer support assets, fewer people in the community, fewer folks at home or in their schools or friends, they were struggling and found to be more middling.
So that's very interesting, because some of the research that's been coming out of Johns Hopkins by Christy Bethel, who was one of the leading ACEs research, and now she's focusing on what are the protective factors that can help develop resilience among children, is consistent with that we hear that having those significant relationships, having a relationship in the community, having a relationship that's significant at school, having a relationship that's significant at home, that each one of these can increase a child's resilience, and that resilience, that protective factor, can last across the course of their lifetime. And so it's really fascinating to me, this is the first time that I've heard this, that you're seeing the same thing on their platform experiences, that when they go into the digital world, you're seeing, stronger health and resilience there. And at the same time, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, you're on a call with, there are like 2,000 social workers and people involved in, foster care and child welfare who are on this call. And the kids in our world, they often don't have those protective factors, which makes us especially worried about the kids that we serve. And do you have any, any advice for that population when you don't have kids who don't have strong relationships at home or at school or in their churches because they're moving from foster home to foster home, or because they've come from, challenging environments? Like, what can we do to help keep them safe online?
So I'm hoping that as a collective, we can have the backs of those kids in some way, shape, or form, and just arming them with some tools and resources of things that they can do to help protect themselves. And some of them are technologically based, some of them are relationship based, and some of them, frankly, are just a little bit of common sense, right? So we need to help them manage their privacy settings and their safety settings, making sure that they're not sharing their devices or their accounts with anyone. That when they can't share their phones, they can't share their passwords, because that's opening them to further harm. At SNAP, for instance, if there's an egregious harm created and experienced and committed, something like child sexual exploitation and abuse, sextortion, what have you, we will ban you at the device level. So if a young person actually turns their device over to somebody else, oh, Susie, can I use your phone? Oh, sure. And then they get on a throwaway Snapchat account, or they get on a throwaway other social media account, but it came from that device. They do something egregious. Well, Susie's not going to be able to access her account anymore because we're going to shut it down at the device level. So they've really got to be cognizant of what they're sharing and with whom. And devices, accounts, passwords, no, those should be off limits. They need to use those blocking and reporting tools. They need to be aware of them and know how to use them. And then when I come back to those kind of common sense things, so much of what we're talking about here today is exercising good judgment and critical thinking. And I think that kind of healthy dose of skepticism goes a long way. Why is somebody asking me for a nude? What I just met this person, what's their motivation? Who's sending me this particular article? Is this really real? What's the source behind it? Asking questions, being skeptical. Not everyone online is who they say they are. Not everyone has their best interests at heart. And making sure that they're recognizing what is in fact exploitation and abuse of both themselves and of others, and knowing that it's reportable conduct and it's often illegal. And to be concerned about others just as much as you might be concerned to it happening to you. So be an upstander, right? Don't be a bystander, be an upstander, and know that there's some trusted adult out there. All of the professionals, all of the practitioners that you just mentioned on the call, Warren, to make sure that they can go to someone and that they will listen, they will address their concerns, and again, plotting that course of action together.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Ian?
Really quickly, I just wanted to bounce off that, sort of agreeing strongly with what Jacqueline said, but I think about those children who are in that risk position. I think it's important to note that the stereotype of stranger danger and it's someone sitting behind a laptop, in the research is showing that many instances of abuse are carried out by people in the circle of trust, whether that be peers, whether that be parents, which is an incredibly difficult message. As a parent myself, I find that really hard to get my head around, but that's what we're seeing. So in some cases, the family environment may not be a safe environment. That may be where the abuse is taking place. So I think that's on us as a community to design interventions and design preventative measures as far as possible to try and address that and tailor to what we know from the research on perpetration.
Thank you, Anne. I want to just tell our audience that in 10 minutes, we're going to open the discussion up to your questions as well. So if you could start populating the chat with any questions you have for this incredible panel, I'd appreciate it. In the meanwhile, I'm going to come back to you, Sean, and you have a reputation of really inspiring members of the Tech Coalition to invest much more heavily in research. And I'm wondering if that research is being made available to the public. Are you partnering with academics in conducting that research, or is it research that's being conducted internally and is being kept internally, similar to the scandal that Frances Hogan brought public?
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, the Tech Coalition has a large commitment to investing in research that will guide companies in their interventions and their prevention measures. And that research runs through the End Violence Organization, which is now called the Safe Online Research Fund, which came out of End Violence Against Children. And that research is not private. It will be published. It's being done by academics. Last week we were at the Stanford Internet Observatory gathering, and we gathered I think there's 15 different researchers along with our industry representatives so that they could hear from them about their research, because it's research is great, but if it doesn't result in sort of tangible outcomes, it's not going to make any difference, right? And so we're trying to sort of bridge between the academic research side and the practical tangible intervention side and bring those together. So it's not I think those researchers will publish their research, and the research is on everything from sort of typical predator type patterns of behaviors of predators in different situations. Some of the research might be on wellness for content moderators, how to preserve them in the face of all this horrific material, et cetera. So the research covers a range of issues that will help companies do a better job on protecting kids on their platforms.
Thank you, Sean. I know that there is a lot of talk, and this is for any of the three of you, and you too, Ernie, if you have any thoughts or insights into this. But when you look at the increased suicidality that we've been witnessing among youth, the point is often made that increase in both suicidal ideation and youth suicide started to go up at the same time that social media entered into the American mainstream. And although correlation is not causation, as all good researchers know, I'm wondering if you've been able to identify, if you're conducting research that helps you to identify when someone might be moving more towards a suicidal ideation trajectory, and identified ways to disrupt that, similar to what Jacqueline was describing earlier when she was looking at youth mental health and their engagement with digital platforms, and saying, hey, if you have outside support, you're going to do better in the digital environment. But what about those online experiences? Do you have a sense of when kids are basically at risk of taking their own life, and are there systems that are being developed to disrupt that process?
I'll make a couple of points if I may, Warren. First of all, I want to focus this on the notion of reporting. So I didn't get to go through all the details of what SNAP does in terms of its proactive efforts to detect child sexual exploitation and abuse or what have you, and then we have reactive efforts. The reactive efforts really focus on reporting by other members of the community, or if two people are engaged in a private chat, for instance, and there's something that is exchanged, whether it be a photo or commentary or something that bears reporting that is a violation of our community guidelines. We need to know about that. And that also goes for if someone is sharing in a private chat, for instance, that they might be thinking about making that ultimate sacrifice. We rely on people reporting to us. That's what I was talking about in terms of being an upstander. Reporting is so important because we consider private chat on Snapchat the 21st century equivalent of a telephone call. And we're not going to dip in there to see what you're talking about in your private chat, no more than we're going to get on a phone and see what you're talking about over a landline or a mobile line. So reporting is so important. When we are aware that something might be happening, we can intervene. We can liaise with law enforcement. We can talk to them about an emergent serious situation. We can send resources to a young person who might be in crisis. We also make resources available that they can pull down, as opposed to like a push mechanism from us versus a pull mechanism from them. And then I would also note that, but so much of it comes down to reporting, right? Being aware of the situation, because if we're not aware of it, we can't necessarily do something about it, particularly if it's going on in a private kind of engagement setting. I also note that so many of these crimes that we are seeing now are so multifaceted. So when I was hearing Sean and Ian and others talk about sextortion and financial sextortion, that might start as spam, right? It might start as somebody just reaching out and sending somebody some kind of an outreach that looks like spam. And then it might turn into a conversation between two people, and then the production of child sexual exploitation and abuse imagery. That's another crime. And then it turns into blackmail. It turns into sextortion. And then it turns into harassment. And then it turns into perhaps a young person thinking that they don't have any way out. And it turns into potential self-harm or thoughts of suicide. So we can't just pigeonhole our categorization of risks and harms online. They are becoming complex, complicated, and multifaceted. And I think we need to look at these situations holistically and comprehensively, and not as individual crimes or individual harms.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Sean?
Sean, you're on mute.
Apologize. Jacqueline mentioned financial sextortion, and this is an increasing trend. I know you had some speakers on it earlier today, but where, you know, there's organized gangs in West Africa that will pose as attractive young women and lure young men, you know, young in their 20s and teenage boys into exchanging nude imageries, and then use those images to extort money from them. And this has led to, I think, over 12 suicides by teenage boys in the United States this year. So one message, so we hosted a conference in June with about 150 experts from 20 different countries just on this issue, both industry, law enforcement, government, civil society, victim services, child welfare, et cetera. And one of the key messages that came out of that I think is important for everyone to hear is that, you know, we tell these teenagers that if you ever do something online, it's forever. You can never get it back, right? And because we're trying to help them understand the danger of sharing a nude image. But that can lead to this kind of absolute thinking that, quote, my life is over, because now the image is out there, my life is over. And what these law enforcement officers, these incredible guys from these ICACs around the United States were saying, actually, the number one thing you need to tell these kids is, it's not the end of the world. It's not the end of the world. And I saw a question from in the chat about, like, you know, as we have limited time to go over with kids when we're doing screening as a pediatrician, but that, you know, that children understand that, you know, if you do make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. Life will go on. This is not a life-ending event. And it's always that that tension of parenting and giving messages to kids, of informing them of the danger, but also letting them know that it's not, you know, it's not the end of the world. And I think that's important in terms of this issue of suicide, because, you know, these young men, to the extent we understand their thought process, felt like their world was over because these images had got out and it was going to be shared with their community and friends. So that's all.
Thank you, Sean. There was also a question in the chat from Kat of Pitkin County AFS, and she says, oftentimes child welfare workers partner with law enforcement. How do you see this relationship being effective when CSAM is involved? So what can social workers do to, support their clients in working with law enforcement?
I can start. So again, at this conference we had this summer, we had social workers there from the FBI's victim services, and they were intervening in these cases of sextortion. And for example, one social worker told the story of showing up at the house with a young man, a big burly young man, but he was literally covered in a blanket. Like he showed up for the appointment and because he was so covered in shame. And so I think, there's an opportunity to come alongside, kids whose images have been released, right? And that they need assurance, they need support, and they need help, as law enforcement is trying to go after, figure out whether or not there's any specific action they can take against the perpetrator or getting the images down. And then I think also for social workers to know that if somebody's images have been released, and Jacqueline can talk more about this, there's an initiative running through NCMEC called Take It Down, which will allow teenagers to confidentially hash any images that they have lost control of online. And then that goes to a hash report repository at NCMEC. And a number of companies are using those hashes to take down image that's non-consensually been distributed online.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Sean, because I often think about the fact that under US copyright law, which was of course created to try and incentivize people creating written works, creating photographs and things like that, that under US copyright law, the person who takes the image owns the image and can go after people who violate their copyright in that image, including people who have shared nudes of themselves. And when it is shared beyond, the license that they've granted. And I'm wondering, are there any industry members who are treating that violation of copyright similar to the way that, for example, copyrighted music is treated? So I know that early on when I would make videos of my family or slideshows of my family, and I'd choose a John Denver song or something to accompany it, that nobody would say or do anything. And then a few years ago, all of a sudden it would be taken down as soon as that music was recognized. Is there a reason that we can't do that with some of these intimate images that kids have lost control of?
Right. Jacqueline will come in after me, I hope. But with respect to the images of children on their face, they're illegal. So which would be different than the majority of copyrighted materials. So companies, and once they become aware of that they have this child sexual abuse material, they are obligated to block it, take it down, quarantine it, and report it out to authorities. So I'm not aware of them, using the trademark angle on this. But Jacqueline, I don't know. Over to you.
Not a whole lot to add there, Sean, but this goes back to when you were talking initially about 18 USC 2258A. So when we as companies are made aware of illegal material, wherever it's come from, as existing on our platforms, we have a legal obligation and a legal duty to report it to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. We report because we have to. We are legally obligated to do so, but we employ tools like PhotoDNA and Google's CSAI match for photos and for videos respectively that we know are already illegal material. We look because we want to. We look because it's the right thing to do, because every time one of those images remains up online, whether it's a second, a minute, an hour, or a day, a child is being re-victimized or a child is in trouble that needs help. We need to take that down. It's the right thing to do. And also it's in our business interest to do so. We don't want these people operating on our platforms. We don't want these bad actors circulating. We want to kick them off. We want to shut them down. We want to report them to authorities, and we want the judicial system and the law enforcement system to take over. But to the extent that this is out there and it's exempted or something, that's really not the case. We have this legal obligation, and we have to follow through on it. And also we're looking and we're trying to detect it and disrupt it and report it and shut it down, because it's obviously the right thing to do and in our legal interest to do so.
I know that a few years ago, the Canadian Center for Child Protection was having a lot of conflict with both law enforcement and industry in dealing with CSAM, whether self-generated or or taken by others, of adolescents. And law enforcement and the tech industry was saying, we can't tell that they're adolescents. We can't tell that they're CSAM because they've already gone through puberty. And in fact, that's something that was said on an earlier panel today, that it's become incredibly difficult to segregate the images of teenagers who have not turned 18 and have already gone through puberty, from adults. So what can we do in trying to protect the the legal rights and privacy rights of those those teenagers who have come of age but are still children? Like, how can we make sure that their images are taken down and kept off the internet?
We call those instances, Warren, age indeterminate. So we don't know whether they're 17 or they're 18 or they're 15 or they're 16. And when in doubt, report it out. We would rather have more images and imagery reported to NCMEC. They might have some context that we don't have as platforms, or they might be able to ask us for something and we might be able to find additional information, or law enforcement might be able to do so with proper legal service of process. But we err on the side of more reporting rather than less, because we don't want any child to be literally left behind in this regard.
Thank you. Ian and Ernie. Ernie, I know that you're no longer leading NCMEC, but that you are following very closely the number of images that are increasing literally exponentially this last decade that are being cataloged at NCMEC. And NCMEC has really become a worldwide repository for these images, and it's becoming too much for the organization. And so, as I understand it, the international societies are trying to develop another repository. So Ian, I don't know if you best would address this or if it would go to Ernie, but if one of you could tell us a little bit about how we're dealing with managing this, large data of child abuse imagery, that would be great.
Ernie, please do, or I can respond, whatever you would.
All right, let me respond briefly. The numbers are staggering. Last year, NCMEC handled 32 million reports. When I left 10 years ago, I think we were handling 40,000 or something like that. So the numbers, that doesn't mean 32 million victims. It might be, multiple images being reported over and over and over again. But the challenge is great. And what, as I understand it, the National Center does is it uses its team of analysts, works closely with industry. It does, the analytical process. The goal is not just reporting the image and taking it down, but identifying the victim and getting them help and identifying the perpetrator. So, and to answer Graciella's question, the prosecution of those who are posting these images has increased geometrically, tied to the law enforcement capacity around the world. What we started doing in NCMEC, and they're still doing, is basically providing those reports to law enforcement around the world, because it's, the repository, they're not just getting American images, we're getting images from multiple sources. So the creation of additional mechanisms, currently before the European Commission, the creation of a European Center on Missing and Exploited Children, and building similar capacity in other countries is a great thing that I'm sure NCMEC is very supportive of. So that's kind of my general answer. Ian?
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think it's the US is always going to have, or for the foreseeable future, is going to have a particularly important of the number of widely used platforms around the world that are headquartered in the United States, and that statutory obligation that's there. So therefore, as an international alliance, what happens in the US is incredibly important. But I think one point I was going to make, sort of off the well, around identifying ages is, generative AI is going to come into play on this, and you are going to have AI. We're already seeing AI created representatives. Now that's illegal in US, UK, and a number of other jurisdictions, but in other jurisdictions it's not illegal. So law enforcement have to somehow decide between an AI created image and whether that's real or not. So that there is going to be complexity coming down the track. I know there's a lot of thinking on already how to address that, but it's we're not. I think we're going to be seeing growth in numbers for some time to come, sadly.
And let me just add one more thing. Ian mentioned earlier the UNICRI initiative, AI for Safer Children, which is based at The Hague. And one of the reasons for its creation is to use artificial intelligence and machine learning to help ease the burden on the analyst who are reviewing all this massive volume of content, and to try to help them identify and rescue more children and identify more perpetrators. So I think there's a lot of headway being made.
Go ahead, Jacqueline.
I'm sorry, Warren, if I may, just to go back to that, the reporting mechanisms. And the NCMEC model works well. When we are, again, made aware of something or we find something on our services, we report it to NCMEC, no matter where we might find it in the world. Yeah. We report it to NCMEC, and NCMEC liaises with domestic law enforcement or international law enforcement, as the case may be. What I'm hoping we don't have to see going forward is a duplication of those efforts, because reporting in the US and reporting in Europe is taking our time away from finding more material and potentially rescuing other children. So multiple reporting, dual reporting, that's not necessarily advancing the situation. We would like to really preserve what exists now and build on it with additional resources on the other end, on the receiving end, than necessarily on the reporting end.
So this could be answered by you or Sean, Jacqueline, and arguably you as well, Ian. But you're talking about trying to simplify things and standardize things, because in fact the internet, of course, is global or nearly global, and yet we are developing this patchwork of jurisdictions that obviously predated the internet, and you have different rulings coming up and placing different restrictions on digital platforms in different countries and regions around the world, and I'm wondering, is there a likelihood that you will adapt your services and supports to, the more restrictive or protective environments, or is it likely that you are going to customize your services and platforms such that you leave the United States, for example, the wild, wild west, while having a much more protective environment in the EU?
We will always operate under the legal regimes in where we are doing business, right? We will always adhere to the law in wherever we are conducting operations. And typically when smart regulation, informed regulation comes down, it often becomes, across industry, and I'm speaking across industry, it often becomes the de facto floor for the rest of the world. And that's not a bad thing. But again, I emphasize the smart, informed regulation as opposed to the knee-jerk regulation that might be looking to satisfy a particular need. I was at an event last week and someone said, I think very smartly, you know, we don't make policy off of pain. We need to make policy off of the smart way of doing things. So to the extent that we can embrace that, that would be a good thing.
So I'm thinking about, for example, the right to be forgotten. And as you all know, about 8 years ago, European courts issued a ruling that said basically something that happened to somebody 10 years ago that's no longer reflective of who they are today, you know, would need to be taken down by, it was Google, and protected his right to privacy. And as you all know, in California, there is a right to be forgotten law that was passed several years later with regard to children. And so I think about the conversation today and the fact that we fear that some of these children might be taking their lives because they're worried that whatever they put on the internet or that they shared with somebody else when they were a teenager will follow them forever. And so is that right to be forgotten? Is that a smart policy, you know, or, you know, legal decision that maybe we should be applying more broadly so that children who do things when they're a child on the internet that come to haunt them later on, that they should be able to take it down, and that technology companies should be obligated to adhere to that child's request? It's just an example of that, you know, smart regulations or smart policies that you mentioned.
Yeah, and I mean, I can't respond to the what the right policy should be on that, but I do think, you know, there's an increasing effort to make available technology for people to regain control of those images and take them down. Many companies are now partnering with NCMEC in a Take It Down initiative. There's another one running through the IWF in the UK. So, I mean, steps are being taken on that, and steps are also being taken on for adults as well, and through other initiatives.
And Sean, you can. I don't know if the Tech Coalition has taken a position on the legislation.
Yeah, I can come right to that. So we do advocate for specific policy positions. So we're not a policy advocacy organization. Our focus is on building the capacity of our members to do well. We don't lobby, etc.
Right. And are there any other questions from our audience for this panel in the last 12 minutes or so? So Ernie, I'm gonna give you.
If I might, I think it's important. Early on, Adelaide from the UK raised the question of, what if the developmental age doesn't match the chronological age as it relates, I assume, to the point that Jacqueline made about 13-year-old access to social media. A lot of debate now about how old is the right age, and how do we ensure that those who are vulnerable are not allowed to be vulnerable. I think Adelaide's question is really pertinent, so I'd like to, you know, relay it here.
I can come in. I mean, one thing we've done some research with some of our members looking at particular vulnerabilities for disabled children. They may be much more likely to socialize online, to exchange information online. They may not be necessarily aware of abusive tactics, and that's definitely an area that's come up in our findings, and I think warrants further research. I think it's a challenge. Jacqueline said right at the start, 13's not a kind of magic threshold. I think, you know, we would definitely be focused on the UN definition, so it's anyone under the age of 18. So you know, we're operating, and I think the risks change if you're looking at child sexual abuse and exploitation. The risks change as you move through the ages. So very sadly, we do see abuse of infants, and that's, you know, where the child doesn't have any kind of agency or participation in it. It's controlled by adults around, and then moving upwards to teenagers, late teenagers, who have a high degree of agency around their online activities. So there's different. I think we need a tailored response when we're looking at prevention. But I think it's incredibly heartening to hear what Jacqueline was saying about, if in doubt, report it. And I think that wider net helps to safeguard, I think, a bit more. But it's never going to be a hard and fast threshold.
I would note that these are guidelines, right? For the most part, these platforms, social media, and at Snapchat, we actually consider ourselves the antidote to social media. It's not exactly social media. We're different, but they're designed for 13 plus. That's not to say, as I said, that something magical happens on the 13th birthday. These are discussions that hopefully families or practitioners or someone in a young person's life will be able to have with them in advance. And it's a decision that they make together. So it's based on the child's maturity level. As you said, a 13-year-old might not really be a 13-year-old developmentally, or they might be significantly advanced for their age. I have a previous colleague from sort of another lifetime, and he shared with me that his kids were on Snapchat before the age of 13. I didn't want to hear it, but he said, no, I wasn't going to have them missing out on things that were going on. They did it with my permission because I knew they could handle it. I don't endorse that by any means, but this is what he shared with me. So it's a family decision, and it's based on the age, based on the maturity level, based on the family values. I have another family that I work with very closely. That young person didn't get social media until he was 17. He said, no, I don't want it. So it really depends on the family and what the young person is really interested in. And believe it or not, there are some out there that are really not interested in social media. They don't want to go down that path right now. It comes with opportunity, but it does come with its challenges as well.
I think it's important for everyone to understand that 13-year of age threshold really didn't come from the social media companies. It came from COPPA, which is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Rule, which basically said that if a website was going to be made accessible to children under the age of 13, that there had to be certain protections which were put in place, and parental approvals that were put in place, and everything that were just too cumbersome for many mainstream companies to take the responsibility of developing. And so in order to avoid the obligations that were imposed under COPPA, they said, okay, 13 and up is what we're going to gear our platform towards. And so this wasn't something that was driven by the social media companies, but actually predated the creation of social media and just trying to keep kids safe online. And so that wasn't a developmental decision made by the companies, but by lawmakers. Adelaide, I see your hand up.
Just want to say that I am very concerned about the age, whether it's guidelines or whatever, because it puts a lot of pressure on parents. Other parents see us, those who don't want our children to indulge too much on social media, as being mean to them. Because, they're 13, or they're 11 or whatever. And some people are happy to give their children access to social media at a very early age. But because it's a guidelines, and people assume that guidelines are what everybody is supposed to abide by. So it puts a lot of pressure on parents. And as I said, I have a child who is 15 now, but when I was setting up his phone for him when he was 13, I set it up as a 10-year-old because I know that his developmental age is lower than that age. So I didn't want him to be able to access things online that he wouldn't understand. But that is me. That is how I've protected my son. So there are a lot of people who don't do that, and they endanger their children and young people, and these millions of children who get abused online day after day after day. How are we going to protect them? Saying that they should use their own intuition. When I was 13, I didn't have any intuition to use. What does a 13-year-old, what intuition, what does a 13-year-old understand about differences between real, right, and wrong? They just get sucked in by these people, influencers, and blah blah blah. They hear people talk about these things, and they follow that. There has to be a better way of protecting our children online.
So I think I think that the key thing is that the responsibility should not be on the child themselves. I think the child should be empowered and have information, but I think there's definitely the onus is on the adult community, I think, and that's not just parents either. It's about, you know, the companies, the platforms have a key role to play. There's also lots of resources out there, so some of them are in the chat. I think having spoken to a lot of experts in child psychology and relationships education in schools, and the overwhelming message was just to have to talk to your child if you're a parent, about taking interest in their digital life. If they're into Roblox, for example, ask them about that so that it doesn't become something separate to your family life, that it's something that's involved. But I think also every family is going to be different. There's going to be different cultures, different norms, and we're an international network. We've got 102 countries around the table, and there's an enormous variety of different approaches. But what I think we have learned is that children do get a lot of benefit from the online world, and I think we found that from COVID. Where there's a channel to access education, to socialize. And I think our ethos is we want children to access all of those benefits and opportunities, but we want them to be able to do that safely and without fear of exploitation and abuse.
Thank you so much, Ian, and thank you, Adelaide, for that question. I want to thank our panelists, Sean and Jacqueline and Ian, for the discussion today. And I want to remind our attendees that this is part of an all-day track that's focused on 21st century child abuse and the impact of digital technologies. We have 2 sessions left in this track. The next one will be starting in a half an hour, and that is focused on the prevention and treatment of child sex abuse, including online or tech-facilitated child sex abuse. And then our final one will be in a couple of hours, and that will be by the E-Safety Commissioner of Australia, Julie Inman-Grant, who will be talking about safety by design. So please go onto the conference platform and evaluate this session. And thank you again to our panelists and all of our attendees for joining us today. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
so much.
My
Bye-bye
pleasure.
all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.